Kia ora no, welcome everyone. It's really lovely to see you all here. My name is Frith Williams and I'm the director of the museum. And of course, where's Chris Hurley gone? He doesn't need any introductions, but he's going to be up here speaking shortly soon. Really pleased to have you here to help us launch this new Rainbow Archive project, partnership between Pride Taranaki and Pukeariki, and especially to hear from our very special speaker tonight, Professor Chris Brickell, all the way here from Dunedin. So warm welcome to you. Thank you for travelling up. Before we begin, I do also want to acknowledge mana whenua of the land on which we are sitting, Ngāti Te Witi, ka nui te mihi. Couple of housekeeping matters. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow staff instructions and we will gather out the front there on the landing, and if you need the wharipaku, the toilet, just to the back and to the left there. I'm going to keep this reasonably short because I want Chris to have time to speak and also to fully introduce our other special Chris. But I do want to say that this project to collect and celebrate the stories and the contributions of Taranaki's rainbow community is one that we are especially proud and pleased to be part of. Museums, of course, have a responsibility to represent all of our communities, but I think especially those that have previously been excluded from official narratives. And of course, the exclusion of the rainbow community has been a sad reality, as we all know. So there's quite a lot of rebalancing to do. When I was a young ally of the rainbow community living in San Francisco in the early 90s, it was acutely clear to me that the experience of being heard and welcomed and accepted and respected and understood was far from everyone's reality. And what always struck me was how generous and inclusive that community was, not just of each other, but also of others, even when that same respect had not been shown to them. And that's something I've also experienced here in Taranaki. So I just want to acknowledge everyone from Pride Taranaki and the wider community for everything that you are bringing to this partnership, your experiences, your challenges, your successes, your resilience and your talent. And sincerely thank you for trusting us to join in this partnership with you. This is very much a community-led project. So the wonderful group at Pride Taranaki, Chris, Fiona, Dane, Mandy, whoever you all are, will be the ones who choose the stories to be collected, gather those stories or oversee that gathering, and we're here to support that, to guide on museum processes and obviously to care for the material collected and to ensure that it is accessible and shared where that's appropriate. And on that note, last week I was lucky enough to attend the opening of a new exhibition at Te Papa called Slow Burn, Photography by Women and Non-Binary Artists. It's a wonderful exhibition and it was particularly wonderful to see Fiona Clark's work on that national stage, as it should be, as well as some archival images of Georgina Byers. So go down and see that if you can. It's a great show. And I know, of course, that this collecting project will bring together many stories of the contributions of the community here, and we will be very proud to share those with our audiences. Finally, before I hand over to Chris, I do want to give a shout out to our archives curator, Glenn Martin, who is overseeing this partnership internally, supported by Lucy McFarlane, our curatorial lead, and also to Emma Johnston, who has organised this evening and other Pride activities alongside Chris, and I'm sure Chris will tell you more about those shortly too. So at that, Chris, I'm going to hand to you to say a few words and to introduce Chris number 2. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. It's lovely to see you all here tonight, and I'm a little bit intimidated because Frith speaks so well and eloquently. I will probably forget something.
Chris, can you speak right into the mic?
Yes, I can. How's that? I always end up saying that when I'm at an event, and it's a good lesson to learn. Thank you. So, as one of the trustees of Pride Taranaki, I would like to say how proud we are that we have been able to establish this relationship with Pukeariki. It's a very important milestone for a small volunteer organisation, and part of our ethos is about connecting our community and building a community, and so it's also about being a voice and being visible within the community. And we think that having our history told and actually having our history found is a really important process in that, because it sounds a bit trite, but we've always been here, and so we're going to learn some really interesting stories over the next few years. Just a couple of other things about Pride Taranaki. We've got Pride Week coming up from the 10th to the 19th of April. Yay! So we've got around 35 events at the moment, and you can find all the information on pridetaranaki.co.nz or follow our Facebook page. So we are doing a very special photographic project which will include a number of local people, and everyone will receive a portrait by Fiona Clark, and it's called When Was I Gay? So we will have a hub in Centre City, yay Centre City for giving us great space, and we will exhibit that series of works there. So if anyone's interested, you can just contact us. It's going to be a great and a really unique project. We've got a couple of other things that are on sale already. So we've got a DJ and we've got a really cool theatre show. And if you haven't seen them already, we've got some amazing t-shirts just at the back of the room, printed by Smoky Lemon and designed with style. So it actually just says normal, and that's what we are. We're all actually normal. This is our normal, and we're proud to be here, and we want to be here, and who we love or who we identify as is only just one part of our personality, and we have to remember that we have a right to be here, and we certainly are. So enough of the sermon. I've had a wine, so that was quite brief really. Having Chris Brickle here is a really momentous occasion, and so I have to acknowledge Pukeariki in actually making this happen. It's a really unique opportunity and coming together of a whole lot of different stars aligning, really. So Chris, you may know, has published a number of books. He's a prolific writer, and I think I got mine signed last night. A seminal work was called Mates and Lovers, which records photography of same-sex couples, and it's a huge benchmark in terms of New Zealand photography and work. But there's many other books, and the latest, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was editing the Robert Lord Diaries, and an amazing New Zealander who lived in New York and Dunedin. But a really, really great read, and so your talent in turning these works into really readable books is amazing. So tonight we are here to celebrate the start of the archive project, and I have to mention that this archive project was first mooted in 2019, and so there was work done between Pukeariki, Creative New Zealand and Shannon Novak, so we do acknowledge that. The project didn't proceed after COVID, but we're really lucky now through Glenn and Frith that we've been able to bring this to fruition and make it work. And had a walk around the prison today with Chris Brickle, and his knowledge is amazing, the story is amazing. I won't talk about it, but we're really honoured to have you here, and thank you so much for making the journey.
Kia ora, Chris, thank you. Kia ora koutou. Hey, it's so nice to be here. I've travelled up, did a little road trip, so it was quite fun. Flew into Wellington from Dunedin and ended up here, and now here I am staring at a screen, hoping that when I press a button something's going to happen. Yes! Please just let me know if you need me to speak up or swallow the microphone slightly more. So thanks for your wonderful introduction, Chris. Tonight I want to talk about the next book project I'm doing, which is looking at New Plymouth Prison during the period between 1917 and 1952, at which point, as many of you will know, of course, this was the prison in which about 90% of those men who were convicted of having sex with other males were imprisoned. If you could get high up enough on the hill, which we tried to do this afternoon and kind of couldn't quite, you might sort of see into this kind of part of the prison. But tonight I want to talk a little bit about the space of the prison. I want to talk about the experiences of the men who were there, and I want to think about what this means in terms of thinking about queer history, I guess. So the prison, the current stone buildings, there were previous prison buildings on the site that date a little bit earlier. The current stone buildings date from 1879 to 1885. They were built largely by prison labour, and they were built at a time when the latest fashion in prison design was what was known as the single cell system, or the silent system. Now, this was based on the idea of the monk's cell, and so what the monk is meant to do is sit in their cell and think about the world in a profound kind of way. What you are meant to do is sit in your cell and think about the wrong things that you did and kind of repent. But there was a whole lot more to the regime than that, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that tonight. In the period between 1917 and 1952, as Berkeley Dallard, who was the Controller General of Prison, said, this prison is confined almost exclusively to sexual perverts. That's the term that was used at the time, i.e. homosexuals. In fact, one of the wings of the prison was used for local prisoners, but the other two wings were used for the homosexual prisoners, and this was operated as much as possible as a two sort of prison system. The prisoners only came together at church services. This proved useful for some of them in the back row, as I will talk about later, but not yet. This was conceived of in some ways as a reformatory, halfway between a prison and an asylum. And I want to talk about the relationship between the prison and the asylum in general terms quite a lot, because one of the key figures here was the medical officer Sidney Allen, who I'll come to in a moment, and Allen worked with Truby King at Seacliff Lunatic Asylum, as it was then called, near Dunedin, and this is quite significant. Barry Edgington, in his article Moral Architecture, The Influence of the York Retreat on Asylum Design — the York Retreat was an early asylum in the UK from the late 18th century. He says this whole thing was a balance between confinement and treatment. So we're going to look at this balance between confinement and treatment tonight. But I want to do it through telling the stories of some individual men. Now, there are some problems and issues with this. And one of them is that some of the sources I use are restricted or classified sources, and other sources are not. So, we've got prisoner files. Now, prisoner files are unrestricted after 100 years. I can name the men in the files that are older than 100 years, but not those earlier, so I'm having to use pseudonyms for them. However, the police gazettes are unrestricted after before 1955, and newspaper reports are totally unrestricted. So some men I can actually talk about in a more open way than others. Here are John Jamieson and John Murphy, photographed in 1939. These two men were about 21 or 22, and they were arrested for having sex together in Auckland in 1939. Jamieson was a display artist, a commercial artist, who later went on to serve in the Air Force. and I can't remember much about John Murphy. They were arrested, and Jamieson was sent to New Plymouth Prison for 3 years. His partner, John Murphy, was split up from him, and he was moved to Hotu Prison, now Tongariro. He spent about the same amount of time there. So men were sometimes separated from one another and moved into different prisons. Sometimes they were not. So Jamieson served his entire sentence at New Plymouth. I can name him because his story comes from the newspaper and the police gazettes. Other men I can't, but some of my favourite prisoners I can, because they're in the earlier period. I'm going to introduce you soon to a guy called Harry Wilson. But before I introduce you to Harry and some of his friends, I'm actually going to show you a couple more pictures. So, here we have the prison. So, I want to do this thing of walking away from the microphone, and I probably shouldn't. But I'm going to do it quickly. So, here's the quarry. The remains of that are still there, and you can wander around it. And we did this afternoon, and man, it was cool. Here is the prison block here. These are the 3 wings. So this is the south wing, the east wing, and the west wing. And the admin offices at the front. And we saw today that someone has smashed a window at the front, so you can actually peer into what used to be the superintendent's office, if you want to do that. So go and have a bit of a look and stare through the window and go, oh, superintendent used to be in there. So that's where prisoners were taken to be told off, examined and otherwise admonished. I'm going to come back to that theme too in a little bit. Okay, so here's a picture of here's an aerial photograph of the prison. This comes to us all courtesy of Rachel Sonius, who sent this to me, having found it online. There are other photos that Rachel and her colleagues found. I'm going to come to those in just a moment. You can see the warders' houses at the front. These have mostly gone now. There are other houses at the back of the prison. If you look at the top, you can see this massive garden area. So the prison grew most of its food. Further at the top, there's the piggery. So some of the more trusted prisoners would be at work in the piggery. Most of this garden is now under a newer low security unit called Unit 2. So the garden doesn't really survive, neither do the piggeries. The prison had its own cows. It would slaughter its own beasts for meat, and had a bakery which produced bread for both itself and also the old Whanganui prison. I'm on a mission to find out where the old Whanganui prison was. I don't know. It's not the site of the new prison at Kaitoku. That was built later on. But there was a sort of partner institution to which some of the older men were sent in Whanganui. Okay, do you want to see what it sort of looked like inside? All right, here we go. Here is a drainage plan, which is the closest we can get to a floor plan. Now, as I mentioned, warders' cottages out the front and at the back. And you can see the offices at the front. So the one with the broken window is the bottom one just here. Now, I know some of you, put your hand up if you have ever been inside the prison. I've talked to at least one person who has in the prison, and Fiona and Chris, and a few of you others. There was that open day in 2013, which I'm really sad that I missed. A lot of this area has been rebuilt in here, but the 2 main cell wings, which is where most of the homosexual prisoners were housed, are still in existence. Laundry at the end, bathroom at the end, and another. Really shit hot water system, so they actually had to carry hot water from one end of the prison to another, and one prisoner actually had a heart attack and died while carting buckets of water before they sorted out the water system. The kitchen, I'm going to come back to talk about the kitchen in a little while. The front yard, which has been built over mostly at the front. The other yard is sort of still there, but there are some separate yards in there. Woodshed and workshops now have newer admin buildings built on them. There's a bakehouse at the end, and I'm going to mention the bakehouse again. There was some plumbing, so the bathrooms were plumbed in, and there were flush toilets in the yards here and here and here and at the top. not in the cells. I'm going to come back to that in a moment too. Sorry, there's so much detail. And also, just a warning, there is going to be an audience participation exercise, but it's the easiest one you've ever done in your entire lives. So don't worry, it's very simple. In fact, it can only roughly be described as audience participation because no one has to say anything. So don't worry, it's going to be quite straightforward. Having warned you, I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about Sydney Allen. Sydney Allen was the medical officer between 1928 and 1952. So through a lot of the regime, one man had a lot to say about the treatment of homosexual prisoners. This is Sydney Allen in about 1911 in New Plymouth, but he wasn't based here. He was born in Port Chalmers. He was trained at Otago University and also trained at Edinburgh, and he was in France for a little while. He was obsessed with the homosexual life of Paris. But that's a topic for another occasion. But an evocative obsession, I think. He was really into, as was William Dineen, who was the superintendent at the time when Allen was here, he was into what was known as moral treatment. Now, this was the approach adopted by Truby King at Seacliff Asylum and by William Tuke at the York Retreat, which I mentioned just before. The idea of moral treatment was about treating or training the people under its care to be upright moral citizens, but also to have a control over themselves and also to be happy about the kind of life that they could live. So in Old French, morale actually is where we get both moral and morale from. So moral treatment refers to both well-being and self-control, all at the same time. So this was the philosophy that Allen was using at New Plymouth. I don't know, there might be people here who can kind of connect back to Allen in some kind of way, but he was regarded by Dineen as being very, very eccentric. And when Allen was appointed, Dineen said, he is so eccentric as to practically be mental. And then they appointed him. So that was quite curious. I would love to have known him. He sounds like a fascinating and interesting character. He was both kind and strict all at the same time, as would a man from his time be. Now, one of the things with prisons and asylums is that you often end up running across the work of French philosopher Michel Foucault. And I could have talked more about Foucault tonight, but I'm not going to. What I want to do, though, is to introduce you to this idea. According to Foucault, through the period from about the 18th and 19th centuries onward, he suggests that sex was not something one simply judged. It was a thing one administered. In other words, it was something that had to be managed in order to optimise the population, optimise the kind of demographic basis for capitalism, keeping workers healthy in order that they worked hard in order to generate profits, and that forms of sexuality that kind of cut across this imperative needed to be managed. So this idea of sex being administered, I think, is really interesting to me. The question is, what did that administration look like? How was sex managed? How was the sexuality of prisoners managed? And that's one of the things I want to look at in this project. So just moving on briefly from Allen for a moment. Thinking about that office with the smashed window that Anji and I saw today, and thinking about the ways in which that is one place where the management of sexuality takes place. So that was a place for visits, assessments of prisoners. What's their condition? What are they like? Are they going to repent their homosexuality or are they not? Admonishments, being told off. Allen wasn't really into psychoanalysis, but he actually undertook some dream analysis with some prisoners. What do their dreams mean? What does this tell us about their underlying desires? And this all took place in this office with the smashed window that you can look through if you go to New Plymouth Prison. Who wants to go and have a look now? Yeah, okay, cool. Go and have a look and peer in through there quick before they fix the glass. They probably won't. Sexual perversion, Alan thought, was a sport that might be enlivened under certain circumstances or might be sublimated. Now, he was following from the work of the English doctor Havelock Ellis. Havelock Ellis believed that most people were a little bit queer, and it really depended on whether that was encouraged or suppressed as to whether it actually came out. Ellis was a liberal, which Alan was not. Alan saw homosexuality as disgusting, but he actually had sympathy for men in his care. He was quite an enigma. Dillard was really optimistic about what was possible. I may say that splendid results have been achieved at New Plymouth, but unhappily there are many who show great promise but because of some constitutional weakness or inherited predilection are unable to abstain from reverting to their perverted practices. Well, that would be me, so I'm not sure that would have worked on me particularly well. Maybe it would also be people in this room. Here are some more prisoners from the Police Gazette. I'm not sure if I have I do have John Pearce in the middle. I do have a quote from him, so we will come back to him. One of the men who isn't here is another who wrote a letter to his mother. Can you believe it? Right, so he smuggled this letter out with his mother. It went to another relative who was so bossy and sanctimonious that they sent the letter back in to the prison, and it ended up on this guy's file. But the best thing about this letter is it describes what life was like in there, or at least what his life was like in his cell. He said, the living conditions here are disgusting. A small cell, 5 foot by 7 foot. The window is over 7 feet in height from the floor and is very small. They were very high cells. In the summer, the cells get hot, and as our chamber pots are not emptied till the next morning, the air is terrible. And it's a bit cut off here. And in winter time, they are like ice boxes, and the walls sweat, and everything is damp. There is no heating system, no fire in the big hall. I'm going to come back to the big hall. So it was pretty bad conditions internally. However, there was one modern convenience that actually prisoners thought was quite cool, and that's that the prison had electric light. Early, which many other prisons didn't. So the cells were small and there was no sanitation, but at least there was an electric light. So at least I could read my nerdy books as I was sitting there smelling myself in my cell. Anyhow, the cell is really interesting. As I mentioned, it's kind of based on that single cells prison is based on that monastic idea, because in earlier New Zealand prisons, they just chucked maybe in a space like there to there to there, might have 10 men. Huge numbers of prisoners stuffed into tiny little spaces. So this would have been luxury in comparison. But luxury is a limited kind of concept, really. It all just depends. Okay. One man said, I felt as if the cell walls were closing in. So this is about him, sorry. He felt as though the cells are closing in on him. He then burst out crying and fell on the ground, holding his head and rocking. So you can imagine that for some men, the tininess of this regime was really actually quite horrible, to the extent that it induced psychological kind of responses. I have a friend who was remanded in this prison in 2010, and he talked about, to me in a letter, he said, these cells have the power to make you feel completely and utterly trapped. I can remember many a night pacing back and forth for hours trying to escape its clutches. And I saw him yesterday, and he said the amount of space when he was in there from the door to the toilet was 2.5 paces, and he would pace backwards and forwards between the door and the toilet. And I said, before about 2003, when there was no toilet, that would be 3 paces between the door and the wall. So backwards and forth, and yesterday he said, I could just feel that so kind of strongly, that still, these years later, that cramped kind of nature of those kind of spaces. So the question we all want to know, right, is when did you get let out? This is what the schedule looks like. Okay, so 6:30 a.m, bell rings, unlock, rise, tidy, wash, 20 minutes time in the yard, 7 o'clock, back in your cell for breakfast, 8 o'clock muster, so these musters or counts of prisoners took place several times a day, 3 times a day I think. Fall into line in the dome. The dome is a central part of the prison, it's like an assembly hall that all the cells radiate off. Midday, muster, lock up, dinner and cell, march to work. Work was either work in the gardens if you were lucky, work in the quarry if you were not lucky, work in the kitchen if you were extremely lucky, move from the kitchen to the quarry if you brewed your own beer in the kitchen and then got found out of the kitchen duty for you, into the quarry. If you were seen as untrustworthy, into the quarry. Why? Go and have a look at the quarry. You can see how easy it was to surveil the prisoners in there because of the base and shape. So if you were incorrigible, me, then you would have ended up in the quarry, so you were being overlooked. You can also do what Onja and I did and try to actually find out how to get from the quarry to the prison, end up tangled up in the bushes, nearly slide down the bank 3 times, be thinking, why do I have the trousers I'm giving this presentation in on at the time when I'm scrambling through the bushes, and then luckily escape to tell the story completely unscathed out the other end. So these are the adventures you can have on site. Go on, you'll love it, it'll be great. Kajia Min is an American scholar who's looked at the prison journals of Jean Genet, the French former juvenile delinquent who writes about his experiences in juvenile detention. And Amin talks about time is the stuff of which imprisonment is made. So how time is managed really affects what your experience is. And time, he suggests, stills and expands. And my friend has said the same thing, that time stands still, but it also seems to be forever, but it also goes really quickly. So it mucks up your whole sort of biorhythm sort of sense of things, I think. Okay, now, here we come to the non-audience participation, audience participation. So, I gave a version of this to my colleagues in my department, Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology down at Otago, and they looked a bit scared when I said audience participation, but then I think they kind of got into it. I started thinking about the soundscapes and the smellscapes of the prison. So what does it smell like in there? And what does it sound like in there? So, I'm going to give you one example and then I'm going to make you do the thing. Well, I'm going to make you do the thing. I'm going to invite you to do the thing. Large crickets would secret themselves in the holes in the walls and drive you crazy, chirping all night long, screaming in your ears. This sent me on a little journey of trying to investigate what crickets live in New Plymouth, and I didn't get very far. But anyone with some natural history experience can maybe enlighten me on the crickets of New Plymouth. It actually feels like that needs to be another public talk, the crickets of New Plymouth. So anyhow, audience participation is close your eyes, and I'm going to read out some sounds and I'm going to read out some smells, and I want you to think about your way, what that would be like in a space of a prison, experiencing that kind of scenario. Okay, you don't have to, but this is my invitation to you. Now, thinking about the bakery and the smell of baking bread in the East Wing. I would want to be in this wing. Everyone who knows me also knows that I love cakes. They didn't make cakes, but there was at least bread. Rachel, there was always a loaf. Earlier private joke. Unwashed bodies, sweat and BO. And what we were talking about this afternoon at the quarry was after working in the quarry all day, how much you would smell, and then what if you only bathed like once or twice a week? What would that smell be like translated into the close quarters of a prison? So think about baking bread mixed with BO. The smells that that prisoner mentioned to his family, so unemptied chamber pots, musty and damp smells, so dank smelling cells. Food, imagine like they boiled the vegetables in a great big vat. Imagine like a vat full of overboiled cabbage and what that would be like wafting around the spaces of the prison. The meat was probably a combination of beef and mutton. You know that mutton smell? Man, that's so kind of pervasive. boiled vegetables and mutton, and think about men coming in from the quarry with their wet boots and their wet woolen clothes, and think about those smells all kind of percolating together in the close confines of the prison and what that would be like. Now, keep your eyes closed if you like. Thinking about some sounds, and just going through the prison records, these are the sort of sounds that I found. Clanking of metal porridge tins, the clanging, banging and locking of doors. When you're in a tiny little cell, the slam of the door and the sliding of the lock across is really loud. And we talked yesterday about the clanging of the portholes on the doors as well. The yelling of prisoners and staff, the low hum of talk, chatter, arguments and fights, because prisoners did fight with one another. Just to change gear slightly, there were lots of prison concerts, so there was musical practice. So if you imagine practicing of the violin, the mandolin, the piano, the trombone and the drums, all going on at various points in the evening as prisoners practice for their concerts. Pastors' sermons, bouncing of basketballs in the yard, echoes, feet on concrete, the crickets, the hammering and chipping of rocks in the quarry, and we were thinking this afternoon of the echoing of voices in the quarry because of the way that basin is set up. So prisons nowadays are noisy places with TVs, stereos, announcements over the loudspeaker. In this prison, these would have been different sounds, but sounds nevertheless. It's so concretey, it echoes, it maintains its smell. This is one of the photos from the Taranaki Daily News collection. These are so awesome. They are so awesome. They were taken by a fixed-wing plane, enormous photos of New Plymouth, and you can zoom in. Does anyone, what modern technology does this remind you of? They're like drone photos. They're so good. They must have flown the planes really low over New Plymouth. But in here, what we can see here, these cells here were the women's cells at the time before New Plymouth was used for this purpose. There were some women imprisoned in the 1920s and then not in the later times, but they may have come back later. Fiona and I were talking about this last night. This is one of the wings and one of the exercise yards. This yard is quite stark, but they weren't all, as we will see. This is a man describing the concert. A trapeze term is quite an attractive item. Sword dance, God knows what that is, and hornpipe done to the accordion were both good. Likewise, the gymnastic dancing done by the same artist. The violinist gave a solo. They'd been practicing a lot, making a hell of a racket, no doubt, in the wing earlier. The drill display filled in the second half. First a set of exercises in marching, followed by the new exercises in square marching, and someone did a cartwheel. The floodlights showed up this work splendid. The squad looked splendid and quite smart in their special uniform, sleeveless singlets and white trousers. The tableau at the finale was a great success. This was a man's description of the concert that he and his mates put on. So men were proud of the work they did too. This was both a case of suppression, but it was also an opportunity for creativity. Some men got really good at the instruments they practiced. Some men got really fit working in the quarry. Some men got really live and strong doing the drill classes. So this was a really complicated kind of space in lots of ways. I mean, my feeling of visiting it today was like, man, this would have been horrible. But there were also little glimmers of ways that people made it their own as much as they could. And what I want to come to in the second part of this talk is how men made this space their own and how they pushed back and what that looked like. These were unsettled spaces with real or imagined erotic possibilities. And so men talked about turning the kitchen into a nightclub. They talked about a brothel in the sewing room. He recanted that idea, but I love the idea. They talked about men just coming in and making each other a cup of tea, and then they would be in the kitchen, and then they would talk sex, and then if you had in their terms, and then if you had a sympathetic warder, then that warder would basically overlook it and may even let men have two in the cell for the night. There was one warder who would walk around and a prisoner said, "Man, I'm cold, I would really love a hot water bottle," and the warder said, "Ooh, what about two?" obviously meaning himself as the other one. So there were stories of kind of oversexed warders, and these were all recanted or denied, but you can't help but wondering what that kind of life was like. Opportunities for desire and connection. I mentioned the church services. Well, what would happen in the lectures and the church services is that men would sit down in the back row and play with one another while the pastor or the lecturer was lecturing. No, not going on today, never mind, maybe next time. So there were these little spaces in which this resistance could take place. The talk amongst some of the boys, one of the men wrote, the kitchen was used as a nightclub after the controller went to bed. When one particular warder was on, C, D and E come into the kitchen for a cup of tea and laugh and talk sex. It's well known among the inmates that the same warder lets two in a cell for the night. So as I say, these kind of examples. Not many images inside from similar kind of time. This is the dome or the entrance hall from 1910. This space, even when the prison was closed, was still known as the dome. You can see the east wing radiating off it and the south wing radiating off it. This was used for performances. As that previous quote suggested, there was a really good lighting setup, a portable stage. So it was actually like this room in terms of what you would use it for. I was impressed with the lighting setup, spotlights, footlights, all of this kind of stuff, quite well kind of set up. It was a space for lining up, ready to go to work. It was a space for fooling about. It was a space for quarrelling. It was a space for sitting and listening to a church service. We were talking today about how the radio was put on a Sunday for an evening church service. Half of the prisoners preferred to stay in their cells than to be let out to listen to the church service on the wireless. Maybe that says something about the state of the church service on the wireless. I don't know. Oh, you want to know what paper mache is about? 2 prisoners were punished for absconding from the paper mache class one evening and ending up back in the cells of one of them, but they were only given a very light sentence, so presumably they weren't doing anything other than escaping from paper mache. And you're thinking, why paper mache? The Red Cross had big paper mache drives during the war to make splints for soldiers out of paper mache to send them overseas, and not only splints for soldiers but things like kidney-shaped bowls and all this other stuff made out of paper mache. So the war effort involved paper mache making. I thought this was all rather camp, and it was like making flamingos and swans and shit, and I thought, well, this would be really cool. But then I discovered that it was actually making things for Red Cross. However, some of the concerts did have drag items. So men's outside prison lives and inside prison lives came together and intersected, if only temporarily. And then it's like, imagine the pleasure in seeing Ron dressed as the Countess, wheeled out in a wheelbarrow. Yes, there was a wheelbarrow. And then what kind of insider giggling you can have at that is there's Sydney Allen thinking that these camp theatricals are some kind of treatment, and the rest of us would be going, ha ha ha, that's what you think, but actually no. It's quite kind of fascinating. We're not at Harry Wilson yet, but I feel that we can't be far off our Harry. I think I must have moved his slides later than I had them earlier on. Now, here's a bit of a sneak peek of the quarry. Here's one of Shannon's images. I don't think this quite gives you a sense of the extent and size of the quarry. Like when we were there today, it's so much vaster than this. You get a sense from one snapshot, It really is fascinating. But here's John Leslie Lander. Now, John Leslie Lander was imprisoned in the 1910s. He was in his 30s. He was imprisoned for having sex with a man in his 40s. And get this, Lander was handed a life sentence. Life imprisonment for having sex with another man on the Auckland waterfront in about 1912. He was transferred to New Plymouth along with other men from Littleton and Wellington and Auckland prisons, Mount Eden prison, because he was, deemed to be a sexual pervert. So here he was serving his life sentence. Lander eventually died of an epileptic fit in the New Plymouth prison. So a sad story. But he was also kind of spirited. So he put his hammer down. He was on the quarry. He was sitting on his pile of rocks, and he stated that he'd never done a hard work in his life, did not intend to, and stating you can go to buggery, to the warder, who expected him to chip away at his rock. So he basically told the warder to fuck off, and then ended up being kind of written up and disciplined for this. Then he was a real gossip, so he was like me. And he was leaving his work without permission, and he was idling and gossiping with prisoner John Mitchell at the blacksmith shop, so he was written up for this as well. Lander basically didn't want to be working in the quarry, and one day he tried to run away, and then he had to be taken back to the quarry by gunpoint after he was deemed to have been escaping. A really interesting guy. He was told off multiple times for talking and basically just ignored them and kept on going. So I can identify with this too. So this was the kind of life at the quarry. And John Pearce, whose photo I showed you earlier, said dismissively and wonderfully, it isn't worthwhile to a person of my age to occupy his time by playing with stones and dirt. And my friend says one of the things about being in prison is that you actually often have disdain for the stupid tasks that they get you to do. And he loves this quote of Lander, of Pearce basically saying, what stupid things, I don't want to bother myself with that kind of thing. So Lander has sort of his kind of contemporaries as well, with men who don't want to make pet blankets and play with wool and recycled bits of bamboo and all the other stuff that they get to do in some of New Zealand's prisons. Ebbs and flows of feeling. So men talk about feeling quite a lot, and they talk about emotion and what it feels like to be here. And they talk about chumming up and making close friendships with others. One man says, I have a mate here my own age who I chummed up with when he came 18 months ago, and we've spent all our time together during that time, and also our own parents have been up here to see us together, and they're good friends. We were not allowed to work together and kept us apart as much as possible. So keeping men apart from their friends. McGurk, who you'll see in a moment, who was the man who Lander was arrested for having sex with, McGurk wanted to play the piano for John Lander and was told, no, you need to leave Lander alone. So the guards tried to keep separate men who had been intimate. If men had formed close friendships, this was seen as a bit of a problem. You were meant to have mates, but you weren't meant to be too close as friends, because that suggested an intimacy that was too much. These rules are still in force in at least one New Zealand prison, Tongariro, that will not permit any kind of close romantic relationship with prisoners, between prisoners, and will split them up and send them to other units or send them elsewhere around the country. So at least one prison still follows some of the patterns that were established at New Plymouth. This letter here is from one man to another. Dear, and I've had to remove this for anonymity, I had the feeling that morning that you wanted this other prisoner and not me, and that is how it came about. I shall forgive you if you will only shake hands and be mates forevermore. I told you I'm your best friend. You don't know it, but I hope to be in the future. So this note was passed from one man to another, confiscated and put on his record. And prisoners would be watched for sense of a friendship that became too close and too much of one. There were love triangles where prisoner A would get together with prisoner B, and then they get to fall out, and prisoner B would get together with prisoner C, and then prisoner C would be jealous of C, and or was it A or something, and everyone end up getting jealous of everyone else, and then they start fighting, and all of this kind of stuff. And Deneen said, I don't really know how to describe this, but the closest I would get is friendships between girls at a boarding school. And this idea that homosexual men were somewhat feminine enough to be closer to boarding school girls is also an idea that Havelock Ellis had. Prisoners and guards assessed one another all the time, as they do now too. Of one prisoner, the staff said he is of an effeminate type and it is necessary to keep him under very close observation. Now, I'm curious about these two things because it sounds like the second thing follows on inexorably from the first thing. If he is an effeminate type, it is therefore necessary, or whether they were just two observations that happened to be strung together. So it's quite kind of interesting. In the second, a prisoner described a warder as, and I love this very much, a pale, sandy-haired little thing with very chilly eyes and a nasty little mean mouth. And I love the campness of the description. Another one he described as a blustering, bragging, fat-ass German swine and liar. So the prisoners could be judgmental of the guards just as the reverse kind of happens, and you know, this hasn't necessarily changed an awful lot. Here's another kind of the Taranaki Daily News photos. This one gives another good view of the dome and the front administration complex and a little piece of the yard. I want to talk now, before I finally get to my Harry, about Albert and Thomas. So these guys, Albert McGurk, as I mentioned, in prison for having sex with John Lander on the Auckland waterfront in 1910, and Thomas Tucker, who was arrested for something, I can't exactly remember what. Harry Wilson, who we will come to in a moment, reported that prisoner Tucker and McGurk, Tucker had a slit in the side of his trousers about the thigh, and I believe something improper was going on. It was about 3 weeks ago, said Wilson. And so what these guys had done is got a crowbar from the workshop and split the seam up of their trousers so they could sit together in the yard or in the backyard of the lecture and basically stick their hands in each other's trousers and fall around as they were kind of sitting there. And Harry Wilson, as we'll see, he was a narc as well as kind of very bad. And he then said, this is Wilson again, he says, the mentioned prisoners behaved in an improper manner. I mean, you can see him just kind of like bitchily kind of reporting on them. I may state, acting on the information I received, that I examined prisoner Tucker, this was the superintendent, that I examined prisoner Tucker's trousers last Sunday and found the seams on both legs about 4 inches below the hips cut, so that two men sitting together, one man could place his hand in the slit and play with the other in an improper manner, which in my opinion was done. So the superintendent says, I had Tucker brought before me, and he stated that the holes were made by a crowbar on the works, as I just mentioned just before. And my favourite part of this quote, prisoner Tucker's trousers are now under my immediate care. Exhibit A. Now, prisoner Lander, who we have met, Wilson, who I have a photo of in just a moment for you, prisoner Lander shook his body at me while he was in the closet. Okay, so here are the closets or the toilets at the top. I believe this is a photo from the 1970s, but I believe in our time they had no doors because that improved surveillance. So Lander stood in the toilet doorway and shook himself at Harry Wilson. And the jailer didn't know what this meant. He's responded that Wilson had not provided proof that anything improper took place. I'm unable to grasp what you are complaining of. So the superintendent didn't understand this little display of kind of, no, I'm not going to do it now. I'll leave you to imagine it. Imagine me standing there waggling myself at you as if I'm standing there. So really, the sociologist Irving Goffman would describe this as a matter of the definition of a situation. So in other words, Wilson was working with the definition of a situation that meant that something indecent was going on. The superintendent didn't understand what standing and waggling oneself in the doorway could possibly mean, and so he thought that Harry Wilson was just talking bullshit again, which Wilson did much of the time. All right. You want to see Harry? Here's Harry. I love Harry. Harry was so cool. He was arrested in 1911 in Auckland, and he was imprisoned at Mount Eden. And he was transferred in the group with Lander and others when the New Plymouth regime began. he was brought down here, and he was such a pain that they actually got rid of him and sent him back up to Mount Eden again, on the grounds that he suffered from eczema, and so Auckland would be a better climate for him. Anyway, Wilson was a complete handful. So the reason I have a photo here is that one of the problems with him is that he would do stuff like, he would be in his cell, he'd put his stool in the hooks where the hammocks used to hang, and then stretch up to the windows, which as you can see was really high, and then basically chatter to the prisoners in the yard below when he was meant to be doing silent treatment in his cell. So that's one of the things he would do. But the benefit of this is that you can see the gardens and the palm tree and the flower beds and the flower edges and this garden up the middle. This was part of that kind of moment of moral treatment, that the idea of flowers and gardens and beauty helping people enhance themselves and be able to learn how to control themselves, these were all part of the same kind of thing. Next to it you've got a lawn where prisoners could run around and that kind of thing. If you walk around the back of the prison, this wall is still just as it was now. So what you can do is you can walk along the back of the wall, you can imagine a former garden with palm tree, and then you can basically imagine prisoner Harry Wilson yelling out of the window. And he did yell. He yelled all the time. In 1918, when a ward was exercising him, Wilson had his hand down his trousers and was reprimanded and said to the warder, "Go get fucked, you bully-kicking fucking bastard." And all of this stuff, of course, was recorded in the prisoner's records. And then one night he wanted his light left on longer, and the warder said, no, I'm not leaving your light on. And so Wilson rather ironically yelled, "Fuck you anyway, you cocksucking bloody bastard." And I mean, I kind of love it so much because it's like, no, Harry, that's why you are there. But he also writes to his mother and he said, "Mum, I would love to send you some of the carnations that I've seen in the garden. They're so beautiful and I know that you would love to see them. But alas, prison rules forbade me from doing so." So Harry loved his mum, and Harry swore at the guards, and Harry narked on other prisoners, and Harry was both a tool of the regime and an active resistor to it. And when he said to the guards, "You don't seem to pay any attention to what I say," and the guards say, "You were quite correct," because they'd kind of had enough of Harry. But I guess I was so fond of him because he was so contradictory and so repentant and unrepentant, and you hear the voice of him. He actually wanted to go back to Mount Eden because he wanted to work in the bookmaking shop, and so eventually he was such a pain that they actually were quite happy to get rid of him. Mount Eden, there was little segregation really other than sexual offenders at New Plymouth, and Mount Eden for the more hardened prisoners, so he sort of fitted in that kind of way, I suppose. So he was a narc and he was a nuisance, and he was fantastic. He said to prisoner A. Reid, "I know your bloody record from Auckland, you little bastard. You have no fucking rights here anyhow." And he said to another one, "Look here, Holt, stop sending out those notes or I will report you. I've been watching you serve your little bit," basically alleging that Holt had a lover or a close friend at the prison. So he really was quite outrageous. Oh yeah, the last thing on my piece of paper, and I am going to read this in a moment. This is my list of misdemeanours. I thought you might like some prisoners' misdemeanours, so I'll give those to you in just a tip. There were stories of indifference and resistance and personal transformation. Wilson was very much someone who did all of these things at once. One prisoner, some men just refused to admit that they had done anything wrong. One said he was frank in recounting his sexual life. He declared that he'd never given the matter a thought. And another one, Sidney Allen, I think, said he will not admit the slightest amount of guilt and explains his conduct in a sense satisfactory to himself. Another man said, "I'm not a habitual criminal. To do something 4 times does not make it a habit." So there were men who contested the regime and who spoke back. Many didn't, but some did. Another man This is a photo of Walter Kopp, who's one of my very favourite prisoners for reasons I don't have time to go into. Walter was known in Auckland as a queen, and of another man who was also known as a queen. This is part of his court transcript, which I also love. Has anyone ever called you a queen? Yes. Do you know what it means? Yes. Are you? I hope not. If anyone ever asks you if you're a queen, you can go do this. I thought it was really kind of cool. So Kopp was known as a queen. He was another really interesting man. I've got a blog post on him. Just Google Walter Kopp, New Plymouth Prison, and you'll find it. Quite an interesting kind of figure. Okay, I've got a couple of slides left, but I do want to read out my list of demeanours if anyone would like to hear some prison demeanours. Okay. Indecent or clandestine notes, indecent conversations, indecent acts. So bread and water punishment, or removal of privileges would be quite common for these. Writing indecent graffiti on wall of yard, fighting in quarry, hitting another prisoner over the head with one's chamber pot, going to someone else's cell during paper mache class, I've covered, secreting onions and other food items and hiding them in your cell. This made no sense to me until I discovered that the onion is a core part of the English ploughman's lunch, including raw, because I thought, who would want to eat raw onions? But this is absolutely a thing. And Peter Wildblood, in his account of being imprisoned for homosexuality in England in the 1960s, talks about people eating onions. Irreverent behaviour at divine service, making homebrew in the kitchen, I've covered. Loud singing in cell, that was Harry Wilson. Swearing at the guards, that was also Harry Wilson. Making obscene remarks about the medical officer or visiting judge, possibly also Harry Wilson. So just the last couple of slides, just thinking, there's so much I could say and don't have time to, but I kind of like the idea that some men actually discovered stuff about themselves by being in a place like this. So there was one man who was arrested, I think, for having sex with boys. He had no idea. He thought that a man could have sex with boys or women. He had no idea there was such a thing as men having sex with other adult men. And he learned that this was a thing at New Plymouth Prison. He was thunderstruck to discover that these improper relations could occur between men. He had not thought of this as a possibility. He's obviously homosexual. He did not realise it until later in life, Sidney Allen wrote. And I discovered, just on my trails, other examples too. There's a story I discovered about a woman who discovered the concept of lesbian when she picked up her pamphlet in a mental hospital day room, and she realised that this was her. And she just didn't know that this was a thing until... So sometimes these, what Goffman calls total institutions, actually introduce ideas and possibilities to people. And then writes about a feeling of queer belonging. And we were talking about this afternoon too, about how a place that is not meant to instill queerness, in fact it's meant to do the opposite, sometimes ends up doing that. Like, what could be more kind of fascinating, in a sense, than watching a whole lot of other men working really physically and grunting and making noises in the quarry as they hack about rocks and turn things into gravel, or watching your friends become stronger and fitter by doing the drill class and the physical culture stuff that's meant to make you into a sort of a man who would not be into this sort of thing, to making you into a sort of man who's maybe more into this kind of a thing, right? So the kind of ironies of a place like this are quite redolent. We're saying, why take a whole lot of men who had been convicted of homosexuality and put them in the same institution? Like, this seems kind of ironic somehow. Well, as it turned out, so was the thinking of Sam Barnett, who took over from Dallard in about 1952 as the Secretary of Justice. And Barnett thought it was bonkers to put a whole lot of men who'd been convicted of homosexuality together in one prison, and he disbanded the regime. So most of the men who were there aged out their sentences there, but men were not admitted for homosexuality other than local prisoners, and so the regime kind of fell apart. And I think a large part of it was unusual internationally. The personnel changed. The kind of relationship between Alan and Deneen for a while, and Alan and Dallard over the whole period. Those men thought this was the right thing to do. The prison regime lasted that long, and then when those men retired, or died in Deneen's case, it actually just fell apart, and a new broom swept it away. And so then the only homosexual prisoners in there after that were those who were convicted of other crimes, or maybe homosexual prisoners convicted locally. So in conclusion, I'm going to talk more about this in the book. Ben Crew is one of the most interesting British criminologists who looks at masculinity in prisons now. He's at contemporary prisons. But he suggests that prisons are complex and spatially differentiated emotional domains, which is a slightly knobby way of saying that they're places where complicated emotions happen, and the way that the space is configured actually has a really profound influence on how people feel about it and what that feels like. And his article, The Emotional Geography of Prison Life, is actually really interesting. Here's another image by Shannon. So in conclusion, leaky regimes, right? So the regimes work, but they have little moments where they start to kind of fray at the edges as men push the boundaries beyond what is acceptable somehow. And whether it's a little moment like sneaking a letter out with your mum, or bashing someone over the head with your chamber pot, or whether it's basically talking back to a warder, or graffitiing a wall, or starting to think about yourself in a new way, maybe a way you wouldn't have thought about before, the totality of the regime starts to just come unstuck at the edges, only a little bit, but enough to kind of give some possibility. So prison life then was complicated, just as prison life is now, as Ben Crew and many other criminologists doing really interesting work are starting to discover, and I'm learning more about this myself as well. Men were engaged with the institution in quite contradictory ways. Harry Wilson, man, he told on other prisoners he was a complete shit on his own account. He ended up being a handful. They were happy to get rid of him, but he actually kind of tried to play the system as much as he could, and good on him, frankly, for doing that, as many other men did too. So men pushed back in a range of kind of ways, often not successful ultimately. But maybe if some of them came out and they did kind of carry on in the kind of queer circles they were involved with, we know that there were men wrote to their gay friends in prison. They wrote from prison out to their gay friends in society outside. Prisoners who left kept in touch with those inside. Prisoners who left may take up with those outside and continue friendships with them. So even the boundaries of the prison were kind of leaky in that kind of sense. There's a new article by Emma, someone, I can't remember her last name, which describes the prison as a porous kind of prison, that there were porosities and kind of gaps and stuff. Feelings range from loneliness and being trapped, quite literally, to connection with others, and there were moments of revelation. So I think that I think there's a really interesting place, and I'm still uncovering stuff. And if anyone, if at all, knows of anyone who's got anything to contribute to this conversation, I would absolutely love to hear from them. Finally, by way of thank you to Shannon for his images, and the absolutely wonderful Rachel Sonius. Rachel, I could not have done half of this without you. You have looked things up for me, gone on databases, searched out photographs, not at all illicitly scanned things, and a whole range of other things. So your work has been so helpful for me with this. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And I'm really happy to take any questions or just listen to your thoughts or comments if anyone has anything to add. So thank you very much.
Basic question, just the comments by Amin. About what time period were those?
Comments, sorry?
I think it was the name Amin.
Oh, Amin, yeah, okay. So Amin was writing about Jean Genet's experiences, and Jean Genet's experience in Mettray, which was a French youth prison. Oh man, someone might be able to help me out here in terms of when Jean Genet was born, but I think 1930s, I think the experiences date from, yeah. And so Min is interested in how those experiences from that time can translate into present experiences as well. Yeah. Jean Genet is a really interesting character if you're into French, French imprisonment.
Just a clarification, this kind of experiment, I guess you would say, was quite peculiar and it happened here in Plymouth.
Yeah.
So over the 35 years that was in action, it really, I just need to clarify, it really hasn't happened anywhere else in the world on that kind of scale.
Okay, it's a really, really good question. So to what extent has this happened elsewhere? So there were two localised examples that I have found. In Alsace, there was a specific concentration camp during World War II for gay prisoners that was fairly short-lived, and it had a fairly small number of prisoners because even though homosexuality was legal in France, it was not in Alsace for some complicated reason. The second example is San Domino, which was an island off Sicily in Italy during the fascist regime. About 30, 40, 50 homosexual prisoners were imprisoned on this island. That lasted about a year and a half, I think. The most mysterious example is Cooma Prison in rural New South Wales, which was taken up in a similar way to this in 1957, and no one really... The authorities will not allow researchers access to those records, so we don't even know how long that ran. It may have been until the early 1980s. So Cooma is the other example. Now, Cooma is advertised in Australian gay history as the only gay prison anywhere in the world, and I would think we'd all take issue with that for obvious reasons. But the regime there is very hard to find out anything about. But Cooma, in some ways, took over from New Plymouth, but ironically, 5 years after the New Zealand government had abandoned this experiment. Barnett thought this wasn't particularly a successful experiment. Deneen and Allen thought that this was. Dallard said many years later, when he wrote his own quite conservative memoir at the age of 90-something, that Allen was very proud of the work that he did with the homosexuals at New Plymouth, quote unquote. But it's totally fair to say it was really unusual. I mean, I've gone hunting to see if, looking at places like Siberia and places like that, and I can't find anything there. So it's possible there were other examples, but this was a really long-running one, as you said, 35 years. And I really do think the fact that there was a set of men who fervently believed in this is the reason that regime lasted as long as it did. I think I worked out that the likelihood of anyone still being alive is absolutely remote, because even if you were in your early 20s in 1952, you would have been born about 1920, so anyone would be 105. So I don't think there's probably anyone alive, but there might be relatives. Yeah.
Growing up in New Plymouth in the 70s, it was always known as the homosexual prison.
Oh, really?
And the locals around the area would go and buy bread and bacon from the prison. So that was confirmed when I saw the diagram with the bakery.
Yeah.
Because it was always hearsay, but I think it was probably quite right.
It was a bakery, yeah.
The locals would go and buy that for bread.
That's amazing.
Because the homosexual made it so great. It was fabulous.
Well, we know who makes the best bread, right? Lovely.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. It's continuation really from that comment. Just have you found any other comments from within local papers or around the place about the views of the good Plymouth citizens
Surprisingly not, but I would love to. So, I mean, one of the things, of course, with Papers Past is that you can do quite good searches, but that they're very factual reports, but I would love to know more about what people thought about it. I mean, there's certainly, in some of what's been published, there's an assumption that it was a sexual offenders prison. It wasn't. It was a homosexual offenders prison, quite specifically, rather than other sexual offenders were sent elsewhere. So it definitely, what did locals think of having a homosexual prison in their community?
So close to town.
And so close to town.
It's like 100 metres from St Mary's.
Yeah.
You would have been walking past all the time.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Did you just not look at it?
It fascinated me that close to town and it was out of the country.
Yeah. I wonder, when I started doing this project, I learned that, I had a gay, second cousin twice removed or something. One of my mum's family members, and he was imprisoned in the Mutaka prison in the 1960s for homosexuality, and I learned that my grandparents used to go and visit him quite regularly, and he made a little footstool in the workshop which he gave to them. I had no idea that my grandparents visited their gay relative until very, very recently when I started talking to my mum about this. And I thought, I bet there are lots of other family stories. I mean, one of the things I didn't talk about tonight is the assumption that families would have disowned the men who were in the prison. Many did, of course, but also many didn't. Like, if you think about the time period we're looking at, the 1930s was the Depression, the 1940s was World War II. A lot of family members wanted their men out because they needed them. They needed their labour power and they needed their income. And so those kind of considerations for many families overrode the shame. And many brothers, sisters, wives would say, we don't really care what he did, we just need him out. My mum's really old and she needs the emotional support, or we need his skills for our family economy. And so there's this whole other side to the acceptability question which I've started to unearth, which in a way is its own extra talk, but I was really fascinated by that, particularly working class families. The income and labour power was way more important than any kind of moral kind of shame, and I think that's really fascinating.
Just going back to the sexual offender, and so it was never a sexual offender prison other than homosexuality.
Yeah.
I thought it was.
Yeah,
so I met I was doing an art course here in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it was a guy that came in, used to come in, there was two prisoners that used to come in to do the art course. And one of them, he was a young teenager, and his girlfriend was underage.
Yeah.
So he ended up being sent here from somewhere else because of the sexual. He said it was to do because this was a sexual offender.
That's really fascinating. So what sort of year time frame would that be?
Early 80s.
Early 80s.
Yeah.
So obviously, this regime finished in 1952, and then what happened was it became a general prison. And part of the thing about being a general prison is that I had a look at the next couple of years of police gazettes, and what became obvious was that local prisoners would be sent here, and some prisoners were moved around the country, just as they are now, depending on the requirements for where there are spaces and that kind of stuff. But before 1952, people convicted of sexual assault against a female, or rape, or incest, or opposite sex incest, they were all just distributed around the general prison population. But it sounds like the idea of it having been or still being a sex offenders prison, that idea lived on for quite a long time, by the sound of it.
Yeah, he might have made that. I mean,
so he may have heard about that.
It was obvious that was his charge. But
yes.
He was trying to justify it in the way
Yeah.
he was in the women.
And he probably heard the stories, because prisoners tell each other stories and pass the stories down.
Yeah.
So My friend said one of the stories he had heard was that two of the niches in one of the yards where men were hanged, they're currently bricked up. And I said, no, the drainage plan clearly shows that they were toilets and they were bricked up when parts of the prison was rebuilt. But the stories about the prison and what bits of it are, those stories live on, and it's almost like an urban... that the story has a life of its own often. So it's really interesting that a lot of people do imagine it to have been a sex offender's prison, even though at that point, and they enforced it before 52 pretty strictly. So indecent assault against the male and buggery were the crimes that would send you there. There were 2 cases of bestiality, but I think one of them was a local case, essentially a local prisoner, and another one was sent from Christchurch. I don't know why. But yeah, it's an interesting little spot. But it was quite profound walking around there today, because actually seeing it, I got a bit of a better sense, even though we can't get in, just of what it must have been like, and being walked up the front driveway from the railway station. Because a question someone asked me last time I talked about this was, how were prisoners taken there? And they were basically railed from around the North Island, so they'd arrive at the railway station down there. I'm going to go and have a look at that spot tomorrow and then practice my walk of shame back up to the prison. And they would be escorted by a warder up to the prison. And men in the South Island would be coastal shipped from Littleton up to Wellington and then put on the train. Others were shipped around the coast in the company of warders, so warders would go out and they'd pick prisoners up, travel the country, come back with someone, and yeah, there was this whole sort of thing of people moving prisoners around the country by train and boat. Now it's flying across islands or using those horrible prisoner transport vans within islands, but in those times it was basically handcuffed to a warder and put on a train along with everyone else and moved around the country. So that would have been weird.
Oh,
did
so
it?
if you go up the Tokyo Walkway, I think the old wall up there is the old train line. So I'm not sure where it
Used to
lines
go
up.
down Rowan Street.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that is.
There was, and we were saying at lunchtime there was a tram network as well.
Yeah. She could have taken the tram from the port.
Yeah, because that was our question at lunch, was how would you get from the port up there, because the port's further round, right? Longer walk, shame, yeah.
It's funny to think about. I never thought about it.
Because we were just thinking at lunchtime about what that would feel like to be escorted, handcuffed to a warder from the railway station and walked up to the hill.
Still,
the whole thing must have been pretty overwhelming, I would think.
Do you have any final questions?
Thank you for sharing. I was just curious if there was any creatures also living in the prison at the time. Like, was there any stories of like rats or birds?
Oh, okay. Cool question. Okay, so the prisoner who sent whose mother smuggled out the letter said very excitedly, and the cat had 6 kittens. And that's all he said. And I want to know about the cat and the kittens. But there was no more than, and the cat had 6 kittens. Birds, so almost certainly, because they would have flown down into the gardens. And certainly now in our courtyard prison units now, prisoners often make friends with birds. So they'll fly in and pop into someone's cell or house, and then be given little nuts and stuff, and then kind of fly back out again. So prisoners make friends with birds now. I know that Tongariro for a while had a cat called Roger. So I reckon the prison cat is a thing and probably goes back quite a long way, and it's probably so unremarkable that all that you would say is the cat had 6 kittens. I don't even know what happened to the kittens. I would want one for my own cell, like if I, Now, rats, I guess that would partly depend on the cat population as to what happened with rats. Dogs, I would love to know about, but I haven't found any references to dogs and cockroaches I've mentioned. But yeah, I would love there to be lots of pets.
There'd probably be possums coming down.
Possums, there would be too, yeah.
There's a lot of
that,
bush around.
yeah, yeah. Possums, but I mean, anything can become a pet, right? So, like, my friend was making friends with spiders. So spiders, birds, anything. Because when you're in that situation of absolute deprivation, anything that comes along that you can befriend and have as your friend, that you do. So it's a cat with kittens would have been hugely exciting.
Any final questions?
Hey, well, thanks so much, everyone. I've really, really loved coming here and chatting to you a little bit about this research. I'm going to hang around for a bit if anyone does have any more questions. And I've just had Auckland University Press has expressed strong interest in publishing this, so I'm going to try and get the manuscript to them next year. And then there will be a book at some point after that. But I really would love to hear any more New Plymouth angles on this, because the last chapter of the book is going to be called Afterlife, and it's basically going to be about what happened in New Plymouth afterwards. How do people feel about the prison? What was it like growing up around the prison? What was the life of the prison before it closed? This thing sounds enormous, and it's just going to be one chapter, but I really want to get a handle on what it meant to queer communities and the local communities at the time and in the years when the regime, and long after the regime had gone. So the kind of urban stories about it being a sex offenders prison, that I want to know about all of that, because I think it's part of the ongoing afterlife of prison. And honestly, if you haven't been and had a look, we didn't seem to sense any presence of security guards whatsoever, so it's probably quite safe to go and have a wander around. And then if you wander down the river walkway at the back, you'll be able to see the quarry, and that was actually quite mind-blowing today, to see that. So well worth a look. Cool, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Chris. Do you know, I think I'm still kind of trying to digest or reconcile the kind of disturbing nature of some of these experiences and attitudes with the extraordinary entertaining way that we tell these stories. That also makes them more powerful, and then also these stories of resilience and connection and humour too. Really fascinating, really important body of research. We'll be very interested to see how it evolves, and I think it needs to be shared more too.
Yeah.
Lovely audience participation.
Thank you, Fred.
So thank you again. Thank you to all of you for coming. I'm even more excited about what this partnership can become now. And I'm sure if you'll hang around, if people do want to ask you any other questions afterwards, that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Yep, please
All right,
do.
we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Have a great evening.